Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff, and I'm in Econ 166 with you guys. And here is my presentation on an article I recently found in the news about the EU and its current kind of issues and disputes with the US about the Inflation Reduction Act. So, in this presentation, I'm going to go through kind of four sort of key stages. The first one, share a little quick background and summary about the article and the IRA itself. Second, I'm going to go into the economics of the IRA just as it stands currently. Third, talk a little bit about a retaliatory subsidy that was mentioned in the article. And finally, about World Trade Organization potential intervention in the situation, which was also mentioned in the article. Sweet. So let's start with background summary. The article that I kind of got my inspiration for this presentation from was titled US and Europe Gird for Trade Spat Over Washington's Push for Domestic Investment from the Wall Street Journal. And essentially, the article outlines a recent visit by the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, and his meeting with Biden. And in that meeting, he had brought up a frustration that he and other EU nations had with the recent Inflation Reduction Act. And he said a couple things, but my biggest takeaways were one, that he was supposing that the IRA will negatively impact the EU, and he was frustrated with that, asking for a reversal of some sort of those policies. Two, it was mentioned in the article that if some sort of agreement between the EU and the US over the subject is not reached in the near future, that the EU is considering a similar policy themselves, developing a fund and investing in their own domestic production. And finally, though it wasn't Macron, it was mentioned that Germany is worried about potential WTO violations and the intervention of the organization itself under the current IRA, but also if the EU were to impose a similar policy of their own. So yeah, just a little background on what the Inflation Reduction Act is. It's basically a law that was passed kind of earlier this year, aimed at reducing the domestic inflation that the US has experienced since COVID. And it is trying to do this through a couple of ways. One, it is imposing a 15% corporate tax minimum. Number two, it is investing a lot of money in the IRS to try to increase the efficacy of that organization and make sure that we are collecting all the taxes that we should be. Those two are kind of oriented on decreasing the deficit. And then finally, it is continuing subsidies into continuing various subsidies that already exist, including ones to the Affordable Care Act. And it also allocates almost $400 billion to investments in domestic industry, a lot of it being in the clean tech and renewable energy space, batteries, EVs, things along that line. And so I was kind of curious, just reading about this in the article, about how these policies are really going to impact prices home and abroad, which takes me to our next section about the economics of it, and how the IRA, though it already exists, will in the future and continue to impact, consumer and producer welfare at home and abroad, et cetera. And so when you're looking at the economic impact of this law, there's kind of two broad categories. One are those tax implications that I talked about, but those are more directed at impacting the deficit, and it works with kind of economic mechanisms that we did not discuss in this class, and are more centered around the inflation reduction itself. The second part, though, which really does connect to the topics we've discussed in class and what I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation talking about, are the investment and subsidies into domestic industry. And as we've talked about in class, these can have large impacts on global prices and kind of the breakdown of how the welfare from selling these goods is allocated. And so we'll go into that now. I wanted to look at it in a couple of ways. And so the first kind of most straightforward way is assuming that the US is a small producer relative to the world of these goods that are being subsidized. And it's difficult to really assess whether or not that is true, especially when there's a lot of money going into a lot of different industries. But for the sake of argument, let's just say the US is small. In this case, these are models that we should all be pretty familiar with. And we see that the price, the world price, the price paid by domestic consumers and foreign consumers stays the same, right? So the net welfare for consumers at home is the exact same. What we do see where the change does come in with this subsidy is the fact that home exports are going to be increasing, or imports are going to be decreasing if the US is like a net importer of this good. And there will be a significant increase in the welfare to domestic producers, which is kind of what the US is going for with a policy like this. Following COVID, we're seeing a little bit of runaway inflation, and we're trying to really strengthen that domestic production. Of course, there is a deadweight loss you can see in C there, and that is just kind of a consequence of the fact that there is, a cost that the US has to pay for this, paying for that subsidy for all of those goods produced. And yeah, as far as just quantities of exports, you're going to see the amount of exports increased, and so the total quantity also increased, because if we remember, at home we're going to be consuming the same amount of this good at the same price, and so if exports are increasing, that means that additional amount of production is being bought up in the foreign/world market. But when I was doing this, I was thinking to myself, this is probably not the case, right? Because why would Europe be so or why would Macron and other European states be so kind of caught up and frustrated with this policy if it didn't impact prices abroad somehow? And I think it's a little bit more reasonable to consider the fact that the US could be a large producer in the case of these goods that are being subsidized. A lot of them are like tech heavy, which is an area where the US, does have a lot of influence, especially in like world markets. And so the kind of breakdown of the model is pretty similar to before, except for what we do see is a change in home consumption and the price being paid at home and abroad. PW, we can imagine, is that price before, just kind of either with the US being small or just like in autarky. But with the addition of this subsidy, if it is a large company, if the US, if we're assuming it's a large country, then the price paid abroad and at home will decline to that P star. And that means that there will be an impact, especially in other countries where the price of the goods being exported by the US could be undercutting the goods that they are in a foreign country domestically producing. But besides that, we see again exports increase or imports are decreasing depending if the US is a net exporter or importer. And yeah, so another thing that came up in the article that I was curious about is what would happen if the EU responded with their own domestic production subsidies. And I didn't really see any articles or any models in our textbook that directly mirrored it. But my thoughts of how that would work is basically, if we remember that when a subsidy occurs, a domestic production subsidy occurs in a country, that country now those producers are getting the subsidy amount more per unit that they're producing, right? So they are always going to be producing more units. So if we have on one side the US doing it, on the other side the EU doing it, we're probably going to end up having a lot more production and possibly overproduction. And if these are both large countries, which with the size of their economies, it is, I think, reasonable to assume, then we're going to see on this, and you can see on the graph here that I made, in the export import market, you will see the foreign import demand get steeper because both of these countries, now that they're the price that is willing to be paid for a certain quantity is going to decrease as they're pumping out so much of this good. And so that's going to really affect world prices. And the decrease from P to P star will now be PW to P star star, which is an even bigger drop. And that could seriously, impact other nations just across the world who also now have to compete with this even further lowered price of goods. And that kind of takes us into the last bit of this, which is, will the World Trade Organization get involved here? And maybe will that hinge upon the fact, upon whether or not the EU has some sort of response? And so just a quick reminder of what the WTO does. It's like an international organization that is overseeing the global trade system and basically just trying to set the rules for international trade to ensure that everything's moving smoothly and fairly for all countries. Now, one of the ways they do this is setting rules on subsidies for member countries. And these rules are designed to keep these subsidies from giving an unfair advantage in the context of international trade. So in the context of this situation, I think it's important to note that countries are not allowed to provide subsidies that are directly or indirectly affecting the price of goods or services in the international market, or that are creating barriers to trade unless they're acting in the interest of national security or something like that, which I do not believe that argument is being made or can really be made in very strongly. That being said, even if the US is a large country, that decrease from PW to P star is likely pretty small. But if the EU creates a similar policy and the drop in international prices because of these two large nations having these domestic production subsidies, you could see a change in world prices that would grab the attention of the World Trade Organization and potentially elicit some sort of response or punitive action by them, though it's unlikely. And I don't know if it was spoken about in class or not, but the US has kind of ruined the appeals court in the World Trade Organization. So there's very little teeth if the US does not want to pay fines. They don't really have to. But anyways, that's what I got. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed, and I look forward to reading and watching all of your presentations.